Good morning. Guess we'll start. First off, again, are there any questions or issues or comments or anything? Okay, I'll take that for a no. Want to move on to Kaua'i-Ni'ihau. So we're now in the last of the major island clusters here in Hawaii. And one thing to remember when you're looking at the Hawaiian Islands is the fact that you're moving, if you want to think of it, you're moving from time with the most recent in the southeast and the oldest to the northwest. Let me actually switch over here. So if you look at this, Google Earth here, here's Oahu here, here's Kaua'i-Ni'ihau here. And you can see they're part of a tied together landmass. In some ways actually pretty similar to Maui, Lanai and stuff. We're not really too sure what's going on with that. We're also not sure what's going on down here with Kaula Rock, which I also had to survey once. That's part of this whole system, which we really can't figure out. There's something going on a little bit odd down there. If you go to the further northwest, you notice that you've actually got the older remnants of the same pattern of islands with almost exactly the same spacing. These have eroded out so that all that's left above water is, if anything, atolls. In some cases, nothing is left above water. But you can see the same pattern just going across here. So again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the semester, the Hawaiian Islands are actually this incredibly long, almost conveyor belt of islands. For our purposes, one of the key aspects that makes Kaua'i-Ni'ihau a little bit different is the gap. The channel between Oahu and Kauai is relatively large compared to the other islands. And probably most importantly, this one section here is very, very deep. I believe it's about 8,000 feet deep. So what this means is if you visualize the Pacific Ocean up here trying to sort of push its way down here all the time, there's incredibly not only strong currents, but generally very dangerous sea conditions here. And that means that even during the Hawaiian period, Kauai was more isolated from the other islands than it would appear just by distance. Because if you look at this channel, it's roughly twice to three times what you see in the other islands. That means even in the pre-European period, going to and from Kauai was something that you had to think about really seriously. In other words, it was an actual serious voyage versus just hopping in a canoe and going back and forth. If you want to think about this thing of the Molokai to Oahu race, you can pretty much take anything short of a bathtub and make it across there as long as you're paying attention. Kauai Channel kills people, every year or two you lose another couple of folks out in a boat out there. They just eat it. So this is a very dangerous stretch of waters, and that actually physically isolates islands more than just the distance part. So these are considerably older than the other islands. And you can see this to a certain extent when you look at the erosion patterns. What you've got left when you're looking at Kauai, the closest parallel would probably almost be, well, maybe the Ko'olaus, but in some ways almost West Maui. What you've got is basically just the totally, eroded skeleton. There's been a major secondary lava eruption sequence on Kauai down here in the south, but it really didn't change the shape of the island particularly. So what you've got is basically two remnant volcanoes, one of which is pretty much partially still, the other one is almost completely vanished. So here's one of the volcanoes here with the caldera off over here, and of course this is Waialaealai at the top. The second caldera is actually over here. You can see part of it over here. We're not really sure what happened. There was a secondary sequence that filled up some of this, almost like Halakala maybe. But most of it just sort of fell off over this way. There was also a big part of it collapsed on this side. So we're really not even too sure. The shape's sort of really ambivalent. So if you notice on Kauai, what you've got is an enormous amount of erosion over here. The general assumption is this is actually the Waialaealai was actually this very, very high, like Mauna Kea-sized mountain. And that's basically erosional spill off of this side. So it's a very, very eroded island, and there's not much left of the original, structure of the two volcano system. Niihau is part of a smaller, sort of Lanai type eruptive sequence. So it was never super large. It too is pretty much eroded out. What you've got here is basically the left-hand side of the volcano. It collapsed off rather spectacularly and fell off into this very deep abyss here. And again, you can see the erosional patterns over here. Kaula, that doesn't make any sense. Kaula doesn't make any sense compared to the other islands. I don't even think I've never seen a geologic report written up trying to explain it. But it's an incredibly small piece of real estate. and that's, that's it. So what you basically got are two islands, the smaller one attached to a certain extent to the larger one. By virtue of the orientation of these two pieces, poor old Ni'ihau gets sort of jammed up because it so happens that the shape of Kauai, the fact that you've got this part of the volcano left, very much like the Kolos, acts as a very good catch or cup that catches the moisture coming across this way. So this happens to strip out most of the moisture. So very much like Kaho'olawe, Ni'ihau gets very little in the way of moisture coming most of the year because Kauai very efficiently strips all of it off. In fact, you can even see when you look at Kauai, you can see this process of pulling the moisture out of the moving land air mass here to the point that you have almost nothing left on this side. This gives Kauai one of its more unique aspects in terms of sort of what you might call geographic trivia. On Waialae, you have basically the wettest spot on the planet. It was listed at 515 inches a year, but the reason for that was very simply is the rain gauge only went up to 515 inches. About 15 years ago, they put in a larger rain gauge and it shot up to about 600 something inches. So if you figure that in feet, 600, divided by 12, anyway, it's a lot of feet of water. So Waialae, by virtue of the way it's shaped, is probably one of the most efficient ways to capture water, that Mother Nature's ever come up with. So it very efficiently strips out almost all the water up through this region coming down in the cloud covers. And what that means on this side is you get basically nothing. Now, if you get over here to Barking Sands, which is only about, 12, 14 miles away from Waialae. So here you've got 600 plus inches of rain a year. Barking Sands gets about 10. Barking Sands is actually one of the 10 driest spots on planet Earth. And that's because all the moisture has been stripped out by the mountain system here. And what you have is fast moving air. It's generally, there's always fairly good winds over here, but they have no moisture left in them. So they basically take what little moisture does come out and suck it right out of the ground. And that's why it's called Barking Sands, because if you actually walk over there during times of year, maybe not this last week because we had Konas, but during a regular time of year, the sand will actually crunch on the beach because there's so little moisture. The sand granules don't have a moisture covering around them. So they actually crunch almost like, if you go out to someplace where they have snow and it's just snow, it'll crunch. It makes very much the same sound. That's why it's called Barking Sands in English. So what you've got is one of the driest spots on the planet, literally within, not quite rock throwing distance of the wettest spot on the planet. And all the islands have this same attribute to a certain extent, but on Kauai's case, just because it's a fairly small piece of real estate, you get this dramatic juxtaposition of these two things. Barking Sands it gets about half the amount of water that Death Valley does in California. And this gets more water, at least in a measured sense, than just about any place else on the planet. So to have them that close to each other on one contiguous island is really striking. It's not maybe unique in the Hawaiian Islands, but sort of the compression of size and the relatively short distance makes it that way. So when you're looking at Kauai, what you're looking at is a very, basically all the stuff you see on all the other islands, but it's been sort of shrunk down, so it's much closer, but it's still very much the same pattern. So let's take a look at that. Here you see the capture of Waialae, the way it captures. And so your winds are, this one of those rare days when it's really clear. The winds are blowing right into this. So this thing is like a giant, catcher's mitt. So it's literally catching all the moisture and just stripping it off. And what that done, of course, among other things, is just meant enormous amounts of erosion on this side of the island, as the whole island's almost been cut away by virtue of the wind and water action. So what you've got are these basically hard ridges of leftover material, and everything soft has been cut out. So one of the side effects is a number of very striking, what they're oftentimes called canyons or arroyos. And basically, again, what this is the very much harder materials left. Everything softer has been cut away because the island's old enough that this erosional pattern is pretty much, matured, as you would say. One of the side effects of this from an environmental standpoint is that you end up, because of these very dissected, very discrete canyons or arroyos, with these very, very high ridges that are very, inaccessible. You end up with a large amount of native plants in the back of some of these canyons, many of which have never really been accessed. I don't know that anyone's going to get back into Ukulele, which has got to have stuff in it. But even Waimea Canyon has a pretty striking amount of native vegetation, and some of it's very, very unique to, in some cases, as far as we can tell, each canyon has its own vegetation pattern. Of course, the one thing that does get up and down this area is goats, which is why a major recreational pastime on Kauai, at least I'm not sure about when I was used to be there, is goat hunting. Pigs also, but especially goats. So all these ridges are largely native vegetation. There's a number of species that have never been recorded that are still found on Kauai. There's just not a lot of, there's so much concern about endangered species, I think, and sometimes that no one's ever actually bothered to really get really aggressive about a final catalog of the plants, and to a certain extent animals also, and then especially on the western island like Kauai. Here's your ohia forest, still intact. So you can see the striking erosional patterns. Now what you've got here is you can actually visualize this. You look back here, you notice how you got these parallel lines. That's actually the line of the old volcanic system going up to Waialeale. It's all been cut away. Huge parts of chunks, anything relatively soft is gone. What you've got is leftover, remnants, and these tend to be very fragile, which is why one of the reasons you always get people stuck when they're trying to walk on the Pali coast. Incredibly dangerous hike. You got to be incredibly careful. And this whole area is, pretty unstable. It's also probably, literally in 15 minutes, you can go from nothing to about 4 inches of rain an hour. So it's not something you screw around with. But that does mean it tends to protect stuff to a certain extent too, or at least it did in the past. Let me get back to that one spot here. Okay, this is Waialeale. In fact, you're right over the choppers, right over the central peak. What you're looking down here is basically the sort of southeast part of the island. So Nawili is right over here. It's kind of in the clouds there. So that was actually your second volcano is over there. Notice how there's almost nothing left to give you an idea of the elevation. It's almost completely gone. And what you've got here is basically the flatter section. This whole area here is covered in secondary eruptions. One of the striking aspects about Kauai is, on one hand, it's very, very old. And you can see that in this, this very heavily dissected, eroded landscape. But if we segue back. So basically that chopper was here and it was looking this way. If you look down here, you notice that you've got three small cones about, diamond head or punch bowl size. You've also got a whole series of plateaus and eruptive sequences here. And all this area from Lawai down to Poipu is actually quite recent lava flows. Right around Kaloa town, this whole area up here is basically a 300-year-old lava flow. So on one hand, the island's very, very old. On the other hand, it technically, whatever the fissure system is here is actually still, I suppose, technically dormant because it's erupted in, and certainly in the historic period. And here you can see what tiny little bit is left of the second volcanic sequence, or the second, cone sequence. It's just been erased. It's like an old slipper. It's all worn down. So what you've got is basically only one volcanic system, visible. And pretty much what is left of the one major volcano is the only one that makes up most of the island now, with all this secondary material that's much, much more recent. So geologically, it's a little more complicated. Again, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about like Oahu and Maui, the fascination with the Big Island because you've got existing active volcanic systems means the amount of work done on the other islands has been pretty, at least in my words, pretty lame, I guess for lack of a better word. It's not, they really haven't come up with as much analysis as they probably could, given that you know what we've got in terms of abilities nowadays. Let's see. Yeah, again, because the island's so old, what you have is most of your eroded areas have largely leveled out. So, for example, Hanalei, you've got large streams, large, you know, basically short rivers. Where I used to live out Wailua side, the Wailua River there. And so they're not long by mainland standards, but you do see a fair amount of large, persistent, fairly steady flowing rivers or streams. Again, largely because you've got the catchment coming off of this Waialae system. So you've got almost guaranteed perpetual water coming down through these channels. And what this means is from both an environmental perspective, but also from a Hawaiian perspective, it meant that you had very predictable, stable stream flows. Unlike the other islands, you don't really have a large leeward part of the island. So there wasn't a lot of leeward agriculture. On Kauai, the leeward side tends to be very dissected. But on the other hand, your windward sides tend to be eroded out and relatively flat. So more so than the other islands, Kauai was pretty much dominated by wet agricultural systems. And that had a huge impact in terms of the Hawaiian population. On one hand, it was stable. On the other hand, it wasn't particularly huge and compared to the other islands. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, okay. Well, yeah, just to mention, because I mentioned the channel when I was showing the sort of the overview. Let's go back and take a look at it again. You have sort of a second problem on top of the channel, and that is the fact that if you look at the shape of the island, again, remember you got your wind and waves coming this way. The island's in a really lousy situation to protect ships coming in or even canoes coming in. For canoes, there's basically only one good landing area, and that's over here at Hanamaulu. You can do it down in Koloa, but it's sort of risky. And Hanamaulu has the trouble that, of course, if the seas pick up, you end up with 15 to 30 foot surf, which pretty quickly does a number on a canoe really quickly. Even back when Hokulea is puttering around, she has to think really carefully about going to Kauai because you have to be very careful about where you're going to put her. The only decent harbor on the island in a western sense is Nawiliwili here near Lihui. That was actually till recently, in fact you can see it here, was an enormous series of fish ponds. So the actual harbor itself, this is pretty much all artificial. This was actually a fish pond that was dredged out. So it really wasn't a particularly good harbor. Now what this meant is you have two problems. One is it's hard to get to Kauai just to sail there. Secondly, it's hard to find a place to put a boat where you can keep it there. For canoes, you could run them ashore as long as they're not super large ones, but even then it's a little bit risky. Your safest spot was probably down here, maybe Hanapepe, but certainly Koloa, because you're in the lee of the storms. But then if like this last week, it suddenly goes Kona, all of a sudden everything turns into, gets shattered. So it's a very unforgiving island when it comes to any sort of maritime travel. And we see this classically because when Kamehameha takes over the islands, twice he tries to invade Kauai from Oahu. And the first time he doesn't even make it across the channel. Most of the fleet gets wiped out. His Pelilus just get trashed. He never actually admits how many he loses, but it's a ton of ships and a ton of guys disappear. He rebuilds his forces, make a second attempt across. Second time, a few of them make it across. They land Koloa side, immediately get massacred by the Kauai warriors. The rest of them get stuck here in the channel. The conditions change. Again, a bunch of them wiped out, and the rest go staggering back. And at that point, he gives up. Kamehameha never actually, I think he finally did visit Kauai once, I can't remember. But he never was able to take over the island. He couldn't get troops there, and he couldn't keep the place occupied. So Kauai was actually independent. Right around to the time of his death, they do a deal where the high chief, the Aimoi of Kauai, does a deal to tie himself into the monarchy. And there's still, a couple of groups on Kauai that argue that technically, since they never actually joined the monarchy like the other islands did, that they never actually joined the kingdom, which means they never actually became part of the United States. Sort of an interesting twist on this sort of sovereignty argument. So Kauai was sort of, that gives you an idea that here you have, in a period when Hawaiians were still consummate sailors and went all over the place without thinking about it, this channel twice just stopped them dead cold. Now, when we get into the European period, this has equal implications because you have to remember the Europeans, one, are trading with the Hawaiians for stuff. So that means that European ships aren't largely going to stop here because they can't find a place to park. Which means that Kauai, right from the get-go, is sort of kept out of the whole European trade part. Secondly, is that when the Europeans try to set up shop, you get the traders coming in, missionaries coming in, and turn into sort of part of the economic system. Kauai is still going to be way out in the boonies because it's just very difficult to get to. When the seas kick up, you just can't make it across the channel. Even today, young brothers, it's not infrequently they have to postpone the container ships going to, the barges going to Kauai because they can't make it. So what this meant is Kauai was always unpredictable in the sense that in the European period, it was very difficult to put Kauai on a schedule. If you needed to pick up sugar, if you were going to pick up pineapple, if you were going to drop off food and resources, you sort of had to wait till Mother Nature let you show up there. The other islands, you pretty much do it, whenever you had to. So Kauai was always on the fringe of the islands, much more so than its size would indicate. One of the ironies, of course, just as a notice, is that Ni'ihau, Kauai are actually the first islands that the Europeans, quote, discover. Cook initially sees Ni'ihau and lands there, and then lands on Kauai, then goes off to the other islands. So Ni'ihau, Kauai actually have the first European recorded accounts of Western contact. And they're absolutely fascinating. We'll get into them a little bit later in terms of what he saw when he first arrived here in the Hawaiian Islands. So on one hand, Kaua'i-Ni'ihau are, important part of what you might call the European contact history. But in the European period, it's pretty much, out in the boonies. And you see this even in the missionary, when the missionaries set up shop, based on Oahu/Honolulu, very quickly sending out mission settlements to the other islands. The mission settlement they send out to Kauai, they're pretty much told, well, this is like going to Tahiti. You guys go over here, you set up shop, do whatever you're going to do. Get in touch with us a couple of times a year. But there's actually very little, constant contact going on. So Kauai was pretty much out of the loop with the monarchy period in terms of the developing changes that occurred as Hawaii became more engaged in sort of the Anglo-European, global economy of the 19th century. Kauai just doesn't get into it very much. One of the side effects of this is you never end up with large ranches on Kauai. For one thing, because the Kauai leaders were actually not part of the early monarchy period, there wasn't that whole rule of raising animals like cattle and sheep, goats for the sea trade, in terms of meat, because the ships didn't get there and there was no reason to raise the animals for that. So the ranching industry never really got a big jump. The same thing to a certain extent happens with the plantation industry. Most of Kauai is turned into sugar plantations, but they're very productive in terms of the amount of sugar. But because one, they were fairly small, and two, just because of the difficulties of transport, they never become players in the same way that Alexander and Baldwin do on Maui, or Castle and Cook and Campbell do, for example, on Oahu. The island's just sort of like doing its own thing. And this is still sort of Kauai even today, is sort of doing its own thing. And of course, off of this, then Ni'ihau just sort of falls almost completely off the charts. So Kauai is sort of an interesting situation. The channel really defines a lot of its relationship with the other islands. And this doesn't change dramatically until you get, jet air travel in the 60s and 70s, when all of a sudden one island to another, the distance of the channel is mindless. It's irrelevant. You're flying over it. And all of a sudden, at that situation, Kauai, I don't know, gets discovered wouldn't be the right word, but all of a sudden it ends up with a new situation. And ironically, that relative isolation comes from a tourism perspective, becomes a huge advantage, because now what you have is the original island. What you have is the untouched island. You have the island that's still traditionally, Polynesian/tropical, versus the other more developed islands, which is, a large part of what Kauai's mystique is in the 20th, 21st century, is based on this idea of the island that's less disturbed, less Europeanized, less westernized than the other islands. When you're looking at the island, one of the interesting aspects is, and it's always important to remember this because there's a stereotype that the Hawaiian Islands were a package deal. If you look into the oral traditions on Kauai, you find that one of the key aspects of Kauai is it never actually made some of the adjustments to the later period changes that occurred to the Eastern Islands, especially the ones pushed by the Big Island. Chiefs on Kauai had less power and less authority to a certain extent than they did in the other islands. So if you would, Maka'aina and our commoners had more power. So as much, it wasn't quite as a rigid system. It really wasn't a caste system. It was more of a class system. In that regards, it actually remained closer to the old system that had existed here prior to the Pa'ao religious group coming up in the 1500s from Tahiti. And you see this to a certain extent because Kauai, the named locations on Kauai, you see very few places tied to Tu, Tane, Tanaroa, and Rono, the four gods, if you would, of the Pa'ao second religion. You see a tremendous number of place names still tied to much older entities, usually ancestors. Clan relationships on Kauai, even today, are still very much tied to the land, more so than they are in the other islands. So what happened is the social, political, religious changes that occurred on the Big Island, Maui, and to a lesser extent Oahu, a lot of those really didn't happen very much on Kauai. And if they did, they happened around Wailua's side. And so Kauai, in some ways, if you look at the oral traditions and the stories there, they're actually reflective of the older or earlier period of what you might call Polynesian settlement of the Hawaiian Islands versus the second, sort of morphing into the unique Hawaiian system. And that's probably one reason why the islands sort of had a connotation of being somewhat different. If you're familiar with the Hi'iaka chants, there's a whole mess of symbolism attached to the idea that you have Pele sending her younger sister from the Big Island, going through all the islands, beating up on all the various ancestors and figures along the different islands till she gets to Kauai to pick up Pele's boyfriend, Lohiau, and then bring him back to the Big Island. The fact that he's actually at Aina and Kauai, and there's still the heiau that's actually his heiau. So that's the end. On one hand, that's the end movement of this long, sort of the basic Hawaiian ancestor chant moving through the islands. But the interesting thing is when Hi'iaka gets to Kauai, there's very little discussion about who she beats up on and what happens. She just goes to visit the boyfriend. So the relationship the island had, even in the chants and such, was different than the other islands. And there's not been a lot of work done on that. There is a fairly decent collection of the old chants available at the Kauai Museum, but I've never seen a lot of it translated to English, and I've never seen any of it published per se. So, again, when we tend to think of the Hawaiian traditions in the sense of Hawaiian culture pre-European, that tends to be very skewed to the Big Island, and Kauai is probably the most strikingly different of that, but you don't see a lot of it in print. So if any of you feel like doing something for your master's or dissertation, there you go. It's certainly available, it's accessible, and it's just never been done. So, as with many things, there's a sort of Oahu-centric or Eastern Island-centric part, and Kauai is not really brought into that particularly, heavily per se. So again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the huge things with Kauai is you have wet field systems over a large part of the island. Very, very productive, very, very efficient. And since you have, relatively well-developed river systems, which means that the water systems were more stable. So you could develop much more sophisticated wet agriculture systems because you weren't going to have huge amounts of flooding, in the traditional context. So that was what sort of Kauai was. By contrast, Ni'ihau, let's switch back here. Sorry, I'm flipping back and forth. So your dry field systems on Kauai were over here, basically the Waimea side of the island. But if you think about it, most of it's taken up by the Nepali coast up here, so it's just not available. And again, because you have long, persistent, very, very well-developed rivers and streams through here, a lot of the area like Hanapepe, which would normally be dry on the other islands, for example, you have to remember this is pretty much the same orientation as Ewa on Oahu. But because you've got large, well-developed stream systems, this is all in wet ag. So Kauai was very fortunate in that regard, in the sense that for the Hawaiians living there, The persistent river systems meant that you could have a lot more, very high efficiency per, square meter of wet field agriculture. Ni'ihau, on the other hand, is just flat out a luck. It's a little hard to visualize Ni'ihau now because Ni'ihau now is like Kaua'i-Ni'ihau. The Ni'ihau that you see when you zoom in on it is basically a reflection of pretty much almost 200 years of unrestricted cattle and goat destruction of the landscape. So it's the island has basically been tanked, in many ways. If you go back in time, in fact, you go back to 1778 and Cook's arrival, he lands off of Ni'ihau over here. When they land here, he's totally shocked because they can see the islands. It's got clusters of trees. It had dryland forest with clusters of villaville and stuff. But what totally shocks him is when the people come offshore to trade with him, they're just absolutely loaded down. The canoes are almost sinking with huge piles of sweet potatoes. He's totally shocked that an island that doesn't look that rich in terms of water, so it doesn't look like that would be efficient in terms of agriculture, was generating just a gazillion sweet potatoes. The island was famous for sweet potatoes. In fact, they used to trade with Kauai, where they actually take sweet potatoes to Kauai for, I assume, probably dalo and stuff. So the island was very, very productive agriculturally, and it's something that the Cook expedition is very clear about. There's some fascinating early accounts, that they all have, and they all agree on what they saw here, which was basically an island which is, to all intents and purposes, clusters of trees and all the rest of it was just covered in sweet potato vines. So it was actually a fairly large, very stable and very, well functioning population. Also depended in large part on fishing on the basically the leeward side over here. So Ni'ihau at the time of European contact is actually a very productive part of the island of the Hawaiian island systems, unlike Kaua'i, which is already always pretty marginal. But what you see now is a classic example of nothing but, ungulate or basically, largely goat, but also cattle, since it's still a ranch, but largely goat erosion. So if you notice, your tree cover is gone. It's got almost exactly the same vegetation patterns as you see on Kaua'i, which has been a huge problem. And since Ni'ihau is owned by one family, it's not really ever been discussed in terms of what you could do to mitigate it. I don't think the Robinsons have ever I've never seen that issue brought up. They do hunt, and the population there does depend a lot on hunting goats and stuff for just local consumption. But they can't even put a dent in the total population. So this island, probably in fact, even more so than Kaua'i, because we know from the European accounts, Kaua'i was already pretty barren. But of all the Hawaiian islands, Ni'ihau's probably changed the most dramatically, from purely the importation of your three basically herbivores, your cattle, your sheep, and especially the goats. This island could be the poster child for what happens when you have uncontrolled animal impacts on what was a highly productive island, which is now pretty much destitute, in terms of any sort of agriculture at all. All you have is a few gardens outside people's houses, and that's it. So Ni'ihau is sort of striking because of the enormous amount of change. So Cook comes over here, sees a huge productive island that's just full of basically, food, and then comes over here to Kauai, and again is just stunned at the amount of not only the size of the population, but also the amount of resources. It's at this point when he realizes that both this relatively, at least in view, barren island, but also the tremendous wealth here is what makes him suddenly realize that, one, the Hawaiian Islands are incredibly large, and two, is their incredibly large resource base, completely out of proportion to the other islands he'd seen before, like Tahiti and such. At that point, that's when if you look at the journals, they start to realize the Hawaiian Islands would be a huge advantage strategically in terms of sailing vessels, etc., in that they could provide, at least in his view, almost unlimited food to basically support European, sailing operations in the Pacific. So these islands become very important for that reason. Now, one of the weird side effects in sort of trivial history, let's see if we segue out here, is in this period when everyone's poking around in the Pacific trying to figure out what's going on. The British, of course, and the Americans are all poking around over here. The Russians have set up fur trading operations in the Sakhalins and the eastern parts of Siberia. They're trying to figure out how to get into the Pacific, because you have to remember Russia actually owned a large part of North America at the time. All the Alaskan coast and stuff down into basically this part up here was all under Russian control initially. And so they're very interested in the Northern Pacific because, one, they've got a pretty fast-growing whaling industry, and secondly, they too want to deal with both the China trade and also trade moving this way, using their specialty, which was furs. They were the fur traders of the 17, 1800s. And so they actually come up and they set up a deal. They do a deal with the high chief on Kauai, when Kauai is still independent. They set up 2 forts. They actually send to a trading post, one Fort Elizabeth in the south and the second Fort Alexander in the north. So the Russians actually controlled, they had a deal with the high chief where they would provide military support and provide trade with the separate kingdom of Kauai. And this goes on for about 6, 7 years until the, Kamehameha sort of pulls the plug on the whole thing by threatening to bring the Brits in, and the Russians back off, and the Russian government leaves, never to come back. So it's one of the more interesting aspects of sort of, geopolitical game playing in the late 17, early 1800s, that for a short period of time, this was actually considered a sort of a marginal part of the Russian Empire, in the same way that the Eastern Islands here were considered a marginal part of the British Empire, before the Americans are ever game players in the whole thing. And it says something about the independence that intentionally the high chief on Kauai intentionally, dealt with the Russians because he didn't want to deal with the Brits because they were seen as pro-Kamehameha. So we were part of the geopolitical game playing with this channel. At some point, if things had persisted, you could have had this be a Russian colony and this had been a British colony, and the Hawaiian Islands would be split the same way Samoa and American Samoa are different. So right from the get-go, because of this channel, and because of the social political isolation of the Western Islands, they tend to follow their own path, politically, geopolitics, everything. And it's important to remember that doesn't change into the 19th and 20th centuries. It becomes a little less visible because the same type of economic drives are taking place, but they tend to be played out in different ways. Yeah, I suppose, if you want to think of Hawaiian politics, I forgot about that. The high chief of Kauai, the one that did deal with the Russians, Kaua'i-Ni'ihau, he actually gets invited over after Kamehameha passes away, to go visit Oahu. And when he's on his way over there, the Kamehameha's wife, who was by then the premier, she was running the country, actually grabs him and at gunpoint marries him. So at that point, that's when Kauai loses its independence, because the high chief is basically abducted and forcibly married to the premier of the Hawaiian Islands, i.e. Kaumanu, Kamehameha's second wife. So, it's one of those bizarre sort of, things that are very typical of what happens on Kauai in many cases. So the islands, at that point, then Kaua'i-Ni'ihau become part of the monarchy. But you always got to sort of wonder what that marriage and relationship must have looked like. It's probably pretty trippy in a lot of ways. So let's take one last flip over here. I was involved in research back in the late 70s for this particular spot down here. And in some ways, this is sort of a personification of what happened during the Mahele period, but also in some ways just these very strange relationships that started up and happened and then stopped at various points in time, that sort of, made the Hawaiian Islands what they are now. Back in the 1840s, the Mahele is underway. And let's see, where's the church? Church is, I think it's still there. I don't see it. Anyways, the church was up here somewhere. So what you had was the Congregationalist church, i.e. the missionaries that come in 1821. They set up shop down here, and as with the other islands, they set up shop down here because the European and American traders They're actually already over in Hanapepe, and they're over in Lihue. So these guys want to set up, the missionaries want to set up shop where they're away. They don't want to be next to the other Europeans, Americans, because they're religious. They don't want to be hanging around with the, party hardy guys that are making money. And so they set the church up over here. And so the pastor of the church then is one of the folks that's heavily involved in the Mahele. So as with the other parts of the Hawaiian Islands, when the Mahele starts, they send out notices to all the church leaders, all the pastors in the various churches, and ask them to read out to their congregations every week how the Mahele works, because everyone went to church. It was how things were done back then. The church was sort of the hub of community, and so the pastor was supposed to read this out and also explain to the congregation what the idea of individual land ownership was, because you did not have any background to that. People didn't understand it. So his job was basically to educate his, what they call it, flock, whatever they call the congregation, whatever the hell the folks are, of the folks that live down here in Kaloa and basically Poipu, for the purpose of educating them. So when it becomes time to claim land in the Mahele, everyone will know what to do, and he will have helped them so they can actually get the land that they're due for the property they all work. Because this was all in wet fields. This was all, heavy agriculture. Well, the pastor in this part of this particular area, and I can never remember his name, decided that he had better ideas. So he intentionally did not explain to the population living down here how the Mahele worked. He didn't help them out to make claims. So when the Land Commission came over in 1849 to hear people making testimony for the island of Kauai, for, I own this property here, you should give me these 3 acres, but what we call the LCA awards, that some of you were looking at for the Pololo project. Very few people came forward, and they actually asked the folks that did come forward, why aren't there more people here? This is obviously all in farms, it's all agricultural. Why aren't they testifying? They said, well, the pastor told us we didn't have to. So he intentionally had set them up. And the reason he'd set them up is because he was not actually a member of the Hawaiian Kingdom. He had never become a citizen. In 1851, when the testimonies were done and most of this land had not been granted, he went and put a bid on it, got the whole property for about $100. One of the first things he did is he evicted the entire population out of this area. He actually points out, it's sort of creepy, he actually points out that over 20 of his congregation starved to death that particular winter. He had no problem with that. So actually the people he was supposed to be ministering to, from a moral, ethical standpoint, he actually first evicts from their homes and then actually has no compunction when they die of hunger while he's making money off of all this. The reason he evicted them all is what he wanted to do is he turned this into growing potatoes. For a little 4-year period during the California gold rush. So you have to visualize this is 2,800 miles to California. They would have ships sail in from California. They'd stop here, they'd load up the ship with potatoes, and then they'd sail to California with potatoes because people were so interested in digging for gold that they wouldn't bother being a farmer. So you can actually ship these potatoes, 2,800 miles to California and make a big profit off of selling them to hungry miners. And they then developed, ships were coming back empty. So they came up with a clever idea of actually throwing dirty clothes on the ships in California, sailing them back to here. And what you would do is he'd hire the women to wash the clothes here. And then they'd put sweet potatoes on top of them, which couldn't do anything for how clean they were, and then ship the whole mess back to California. And they actually did this for 3 years and he made a huge amount of money. And later then sells this property to the Knutsons, who were the family that owned most of this area, right into when it becomes, hotels, golf courses, and timeshares and stuff. So this little part of Kauai is a fascinating example of both the Mahele, what it was supposed to be, what people that were really profit-oriented turned it into, even though technically they were religious figures and supposed to provide a role model, and also the weird aspects of a global geopolitical system. You can actually grow potatoes and wash clothes here to be shipped by boat, which took 20 days to California. So it's very typical, this whole weird little thing. By the 1850s, 1855. That business has shopped, but they were still growing sweet potatoes right into the 1880s in this part to sell to California. So that business kept on for another 30 or something years, but they didn't wash clothes anymore. So very, very strange part of the relationship that Hawaii, little pieces of Hawaii had with other parts, especially California. As I mentioned earlier, California, of course, becomes almost a surrogate the Hawaiian Islands almost be kind of an adjunct, especially to Northern California and vice versa. So Kaloa actually had its own trade with San Francisco. That was specifically just between this little port here and San Francisco. And I can't remember the name of the company that did that, but you know, it's very typical. It wasn't at all unique. What it was would vary in terms of what you were shipping back and forth from one part to another. But this very close relationship, that as far as I know, was totally not controlled by the monarchy. I don't even think the government realized this was going on until it was pretty much finished. I know they didn't tax it, so they couldn't have known what was happening. So it's for part of the sort of odd aspect of the way that the islands tended to operate. The central government was really not a controlling authority in many ways. Areas could pretty much do whatever they wanted to, and Kauai was probably chief on that list, just because the central government really didn't know, and in large part, to be honest, really didn't care what was going on the island. So the monarchy never invested very much money or time or interest in Kauai at all. Whoever the governor of Kauai was pretty much got to run their own country in the same way that the high chief had run it into the 1820s. So it was already always pretty much doing its own thing. And to a certain extent, the island was pretty comfortable with that. They didn't feel that there was a lot to be gained by the monarchy paying more attention to them. So they were pretty happy, just the fact that on one hand they were part of something, on the other hand it really didn't have anything to do with them. So therefore they didn't have to spend a lot of time and effort worrying about it. And this became part of the ethos that you still see, you know, right into 2010 with the way that that county is handling the COVID stuff. The state says to do something, and Kauai County will sort of think about how it wants to handle it, and it pretty much does its own thing, and pretty much tells the state, if you don't like it, then tough, you know, why should we care? So more so than the other islands, what happens is this pair of islands pretty much makes its own sort of political, economic decisions, and really doesn't spend a lot of time worrying about what sees itself as a center, which of course is Honolulu, thinks about the whole thing, which is sort of striking when you think about it, because you would think that would be much more likely to happen on Maui or the Big Island. Maui, because it was the political population center initially, and the Big Island because that's where the folks that run the Hawaiian monarchy come from, are all Big Island chiefs. But no, it's actually Kaua'i-Ni'ihau that sort of, you know, becomes almost semi-autonomous, and still has that even in 2020. It's sort of semi-autonomy, where, you know, state services going over there, pretty much they get vetted for by the county. If the county doesn't like them, the county sends them back. The DOE has always had huge problems with Kauai, and the fact that DOE will send them mandates or send, you know, principles or something over, and if Kauai doesn't like them, Kauai just tells them to get back on a plane and fly back to Honolulu. So on one hand, it's a county within the state of Hawaii. On the other hand, it's not just a county; it's its own county. And you know, it makes for an interesting political system, and it also tends to be sort of interesting, because what you find very much on this relationship then is you find a place where they actually come up with alternative ways of doing things that oftentimes are not actually represented in the other islands, which are pretty much dictated to by Honolulu. So it's sort of interesting if you look at, for example, dealing with environmental issues or social issues or whatever, you'll find that Kauai doesn't necessarily come up with a better answer, but a lot of the times they come up with a different answer, which is useful, you know, in many cases, and coming up with, you know, two different ways to approach the same issue or the same subject. But it also leads to a fair amount of confusion, because you can never be sure what's going on until you go over there and find out what people are actually up to. Okay, that's probably a good enough place to stop as that. I can't think of it. Okay, any questions or comments or other stuffs?